Thanks for joining us this evening for our excellent program that we have ahead of us. My name is Avery Davis-Lamb. I am the co-executive director of Creation Justice Ministries, and welcome to Preaching Resilience, Cultivating Climate Justice from the Pulpit. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians and Christian institutions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. This webinar today is part of our Climate Resilience Workshop series, in which we are asking the question, how can our churches be hubs of climate resilience, helping their communities weather the physical, social, and spiritual storms of the climate crisis? We've been doing this series for over a year, and you can watch our previous webinars on our YouTube page, which is at youtube.com/creationjusticeministries. You can also click the link that will be in the chat very soon. Please subscribe to our YouTube page so you can follow along with any videos we share in the future. Today, we're exploring how the education in our churches, particularly from the pulpit, can help to cultivate climate resilience and climate justice in our congregation. Today's program will be entirely run by an absolutely phenomenal guest who I'm so excited to listen to, and that is Reverend Dr. Margaret Bullitt-Jonas, and I'll share her full bio in a second. First, I just want to share a few housekeeping notes for you all. If you have not yet, please introduce yourself in the chat. We want to see who's tuning in and where you're coming from. When you do so, make sure to select all panelists and all participants. I think the default is just all panelists, and we want to make sure that everyone in the room today can see who you are and where you're coming from. We will have a short Q&A session at the end of the program. So please, as you have questions throughout, drop your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you can, please use that Q&A function instead of the chat function for questions. Questions can sometimes get lost in the chat. So I'll be looking to the Q&A when I'm facilitating the questions with Margaret later on. And then finally, this workshop is being recorded, and the recording will be shared out to all registrants via email next week. So be on the lookout for that. With that, I am pleased to introduce the Reverend Dr. Margaret Bullitt-Jonas. She is an Episcopal priest, author, retreat leader, and climate activist. She's been a lead organizer of many Christian and interfaith events about Care for Earth, and she leads spiritual retreats both in the US and Canada on spiritual resilience and resistance in the midst of a climate emergency. Her latest book, Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis, is a co-edited anthology of essays by religious environmental activists. She's been arrested in Washington, DC and elsewhere to protest the expanded use of fossil fuels. She serves as missioner for creation care in the Episcopal Diocese of Western Massachusetts and Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ, and as creation care advisor for the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. Her website is revivingcreation.org, and that's an excellent resource that includes blog posts, sermons, videos, and articles. And with that, I will hand it over to Reverend Dr. Margaret Bullitt-Jonas.
Thank you so much, Avery, for your warm welcome. And I want to thank everyone who's joining us tonight for this conversation. I'm speaking to you from my home in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is the unceded homeland of the Nipmuc and Pocumtuck peoples. Let's begin tonight with a moment of prayer. So I invite you to join me in a spirit of prayer. Loving God, creator of all, we give thanks for your presence with us tonight. And we pray tonight, especially for those who are entrusted with the ministry of preaching. With humility and boldness, may we speak the words you give us, words that open hearts, that shed light in the darkness, and that bring your justice and peace to a warring, troubled, and precious world. In Jesus' name and presence, we pray. Amen. Well, I'd like to begin tonight by taking a pulse of where we are, and I can't see you. So this is going to be, I'm just going to imagine I can see you. I would like to know how many of you have heard a sermon about the climate emergency and the moral obligation of Christians to tackle it. So raise your hand. All right. How many of you preachers, whether you are lay or ordained, doesn't matter, how many of you preachers have preached a sermon about the climate emergency and our moral obligation as Christians to tackle it? So I'm very curious, wondering how many hands went up. And finally, last question. How many of you preachers intend to preach a climate sermon sometime soon? And how many of you non-preachers will give them your full support when they do? And I'm just hoping everybody's hand is up at this point. For a while now, I've been traveling around preaching about climate change, and you'd be amazed how many times I've asked a group of parishioners whether they've ever heard a sermon about climate change, and no one raises a hand. So let's talk tonight about preaching resilience and cultivating climate justice from the pulpit. And I want to be real. I want to acknowledge right off the bat that it can be hard to preach about climate emergency. And I'm drawing this piece of my remarks from an article I recently wrote about climate preaching. And just so you know, at the end of this, at the end of my presentation, there'll be some links dropped into the chat, so you'll have plenty of resources to receive. So I want to admit and just say that preaching, obviously, at all is on anything is challenging, and yet preaching about climate change is particularly difficult. So why is it so difficult? Let's surface some of the reasons. Maybe we fear being ill-informed. You know, I don't know enough science. I'm not a scientist. Maybe we fear provoking division in the congregation. You know, climate change is too political. Maybe we fear stressing out our listeners. Daily life is hard. Who wants to add to their worries? Maybe we fear our parishioners won't be able to handle the bad news. So if I do mention climate change, I better tone it down. I better underplay the dire science. Maybe we fear that climate preaching is not pastoral. You know, people come to church for solace and not to get depressed. Besides, we may tell ourselves, preaching about climate change should be someone else's responsibility. Climate change is not really my issue. Someone else should deal with it. A preacher's fears may cut close to home. I could lose pledges. I could even lose my job. And climate preaching may require a painful and very personal reckoning with oneself that the preacher would prefer to avoid. How do I preach resurrection when watching the web of life unravel before my eyes fills me with despair? Reckoning with ourselves may also be difficult as we admit our own complicity and consumerism. Years ago, a friend of mine, a suburban priest in a wealthy parish, confessed to me, how can I preach about climate change when I drive an SUV? So no wonder preachers, so many preachers, delay addressing the climate crisis. Most of us were not trained for this. We don't want to stir up trouble, and we face an array of fears. So as a result, many of us kick the can down the road, perhaps waiting until the lectionary provides the supposedly perfect text. Well, I think it's fair to say that the time for shyness about preaching on climate change has long since passed. It's high time for us preachers to overcome our fears and step into the pulpit to preach a bold message of gospel truth and gospel hope, because climate change is bearing down on us fast. The winds of war are howling. A war against Ukraine that is underwritten by oil and gas, and a relentless war against Earth herself as coal, gas, and oil continue to be extracted and burned. This week, the UN Secretary General warned that the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius is, quote, on life support. He went on to say, quote, last year alone, global energy-related CO2 emissions grew by 6% to their highest levels in history. Coal emissions have surged to record highs. We are sleepwalking to climate catastrophe. Our planet has already warmed by as much as 1.2 degrees, and we see the devastating consequences everywhere. If we continue with more of the same, we can kiss 1.5 goodbye. Even 2 degrees may be out of reach. So, do we need to preach and practice resilience? You bet we do. Do we need to wake up and quit sleepwalking? You bet we do. For a long time, we may have been sitting on the sidelines telling ourselves, things aren't that bad. The scientists are exaggerating. Or if I don't pay attention, maybe it will go away. But eventually, our efforts to ignore the reality of a rapidly changing climate can't help but fall apart. One too many reports of melting glaciers and bleaching coral reefs, one too many accounts of withered fields and bone-dry reservoirs, one too many stories of massive downpours and flash flooding, one too many experiences of devastating wildfires and record heat waves. And it becomes impossible to suppress awareness of the climate crisis. Our defenses crumble, and we experience what journalist Mark Hertsgaard calls the oh shit moment we all must have. Climate change is real, it's here, it's accelerating. The truth is that if we keep burning fossil fuels and stick to business as usual, by the end of the century, average global temperatures will rise 4.2 degrees Celsius. That's 7.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And human beings simply can't adapt to a world that hot. And let's not forget that depending on their social location, on their race and class, people experience ecological breakdown differently. As the saying goes, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. Low income and low wealth communities, racial minorities, and the historically underserved are those hurt first and worst by a changing climate, those least able to adapt, and those least likely to have a seat at the table where decisions are made. Oh, shit. This is where preachers have an essential role to play. This is where preaching resilience, preaching justice, preaching faithfulness to the crucified and risen Christ becomes crucial. Why? Because the more that people know about the social and ecological breakdown that's going on worldwide, and the more they experience it directly in their own lives, the more they may feel overwhelmed, hopeless, or depressed. And that's why a message of urgency needs to be accompanied by a message of agency, a message of empowerment and strength. God is with us. We are not alone, and there is plenty we can do. So I'm going to briefly sketch nine things I try to do when I preach on climate. Number one, push back against helplessness. That is one of the main functions of good climate preaching. We push back against helplessness. Your parishioners might not have mentioned it to you, but it's likely that many of them are grappling with climate anxiety, grief, and dread. A national survey recently conducted by Yale Program on Climate Change Communication reports that 7 in 10 Americans say that they are at least somewhat worried about global warming. And 1 in 3, 35%, are very worried about it. These numbers have reached a record high. It can be a relief when a preacher finally names and addresses their fears and makes climate change speakable and pushes back against the helplessness and doomism that suck our spirits dry. That's why preaching about climate emergency can be deeply pastoral, an act of kindness to your congregation. Simply gathering for worship can also push back against helplessness. We see each other's faces, we hear each other's voices, maybe we can take each other's hands. How do people get through tough times? We gather, we sing, we hear our sacred stories, we raise our spirits together. We sense the power of being part of a community that longs, as we do, to create a better world. And trusting ourselves to God, especially alongside fellow seekers, can overcome our sense of helplessness and release unexpected power among us to do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. Number 2, enable people to face hard facts. Like all spiritual seekers, Christians are committed to the search for truth, to cutting through fantasy and self-deception. So in my sermons, I share some facts about climate science. As climate preachers, we need to know the basics. Climate change is real. It's largely caused by human activity. It's gotten worse in recent decades, and it will have disastrous effects unless humanity changes course fast. Basic information is available from many sources, such as NASA or reputable environmental groups like Natural Resources Defense Council. For up-to-date climate information, I subscribe to daily news from Climate Nexus. So we share some science, but we don't have to worry that we need to be a scientist. In preaching, I keep the science piece short and brisk and sober. To summarize the big picture effects of a changing climate, I often quote a couple of sentences by Bill McKibben from his book, Earth, which you'll notice is deliberately spelled with 2 A's to signal that the earth into which you and I were born no longer exists. Bill writes, "We've changed the planet, changed it in large and fundamental ways." And here's the part I often say in a sermon. Our old familiar globe is suddenly melting, drying, acidifying, flooding, and burning in ways that no human has ever seen. That's the big picture view. And then I cite specific examples that resonate most strongly with the local congregation. So in California, I mentioned drought and wildfire and mudslides. On Cape Cod, I mentioned rising and acidifying seas and threats to fishing and groundwater. When so much misinformation is being spread and funded by fossil fuel corporations and by the politicians in their pockets, faith leaders need to be resolute in speaking hard truths. A religion that directs our gaze to a suffering, dying man on a cross is surely a religion that can face painful facts. Number 3, offer a positive vision of the future. Climate science has done its job reporting on the catastrophic effects of burning fossil fuels, but facts alone are clearly not enough to persuade people to take meaningful, concerted action. For that, we need a vision, a shared goal and purpose and values, and that's what preachers do. We lift up a vision of people living in just and loving relationships with each other and with the whole creation. A vision energized by a deep desire for God's love to be manifest, fully manifest in the world. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the author of The Little Prince, he observed, quote, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the immensity of the sea. Teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea." So how do you build resilience? By lifting up God's vision of a beloved community and by inviting everyone to join God's mission of reconciling us to God and each other and the whole creation. The mission that Archbishop Desmond Tutu called the supreme work of Jesus Christ. Number 4, explore ethical questions and provide a moral framework. The climate crisis forces upon us existential questions about the meaning and value of human life. What is our moral responsibility to future generations? What does it mean to be human if human beings are destroying life as it has evolved on this planet? How do we address the anger and self-hatred and guilt that arise with this awareness? Are we willing to radically amend our personal patterns of consumption and waste? And what does a good life look like once we know the deadly consequences of overconsumption, inequitable distribution of resources, and being born into an inherently unsustainable, extractive economy that depends on fossil fuels and unlimited growth? Questions like these may hover in the background or they may come roaring to the foreground. And congregations provide a context for grappling with these questions. Preachers can offer moral grounding and guidance, reminding their listeners of such old-fashioned values as compassion, generosity, self-control, and selfless service, simple living, sacrifice, justice, forgiveness, and nonviolent engagement in societal transformation. Number 5, encourage reconciliation. We know climate change has become a deeply divisive political issue. It's so polarizing that people may fear to mention the subject to family members and coworkers and friends. Sermons can open up a space for conversation, and congregations can follow up by providing settings for difficult conversations and active listening. If we can express compassion while also holding groups and individuals morally accountable, we can create possibilities for reconciliation and collaboration that otherwise might not exist. Jim Antal points out in his seminal book, Climate Church, Climate World, that truth and reconciliation groups could be modeled on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was formed in South Africa in the 1990s after the abolition of apartheid. Jim writes, quote, initiating truth and reconciliation conversations could well be the most important contribution of the church to creating a world able to undergo the great transition we are now beginning. For many generations, we have sought to conquer, dominate, and exploit nature. Now we must seek intergenerational and cross-species atonement. It seems to me, he writes, that if the church, the synagogue, and the mosque are to offer meaningful hope in the years ahead, they must host such personal and communal, transparent, and sacred conversations. Number 6, provide opportunities for emotional response. You know, the climate crisis can make us go numb. Why think about the enormous stretches of coral reefs in Australia that died in less than 2 months? What can we possibly feel in response to the acidifying ocean, the children choking from asthma in our inner cities, the rising seas, the ever-increasing droughts and floods, the cascade of species going extinct? It's hard enough to face our own mortality or to mourn a loved one's death. How do we begin to explore our fear and grief in response to the ecocide going on around us, much less express it? How do we move beyond despair? Preachers can offer practices and teachings and rituals that allow us to feel, accept, and integrate the painful emotions evoked by climate change. We can create small circles for eco-grief lament and prayer, and we can hold public ceremonies outdoors. Over the years, I've led or participated in many outdoor interfaith public liturgies about climate change. Some of them were held after environmental disasters, such as the Gulf of Mexico oil spill and Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. Others were held before significant environmental events, such as Pope Francis's visit to Washington, D.C., and the UN climate talks in Paris. Preachers and congregations can create public spaces for expressing grief and naming hope and touching our deep longing for healing and reconciliation. We can protect our human capacity to feel our emotional responses without being overwhelmed. And our emotions can become a source of energy for constructive action to address the emergency. Number 7, build hope by taking action. How do we maintain hope? That is a question many contributors address in the anthology I co-edited with Leah Shade, Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis. One author, Tim DeChristopher, is a Unitarian Universalist who spent 2 years in federal prison after disrupting an oil and gas auction in Utah. And when someone asks him, Tim, what gives you hope? He answers, how can anything give me hope? And here's what he writes. Hope is inseparable from our own actions. Hope is not given, it's grown. Waiting to act on climate change until we have hope is like waiting to pick up a shovel until we build calluses on our hands. The hope never arrives until we get to work. So in my climate sermons, I always include suggestions for action, such as cutting back sharply on our use of fossil fuels, moving toward a plant-based diet, going solar, protecting forests, planting trees. Individual actions to reduce our household carbon footprint are essential to our moral integrity, and they help to propel social change. Yet the scope and speed of the climate crisis also require engagement in collective action for social transformation. The environmental justice activist Mary Anais Heglar puts it like this. She writes, "I don't care if you recycle. Stop obsessing over your environmental sins. Fight the oil and gas industry instead." So in my sermons, I encourage parishioners not only to live more lightly on earth, but also to use their voices and votes to make it politically possible to do what is scientifically necessary. We can support the growing movement to push banks to stop financing fossil fuel projects. We can lobby for policies that support renewable energy, clean green jobs, and a just transition that addresses the needs of poor and low wealth communities and communities of color, and the needs of workers in the fossil fuel industries as we transition to a clean energy economy. If we have financial investments, we can divest from fossil fuels. If we're college graduates, we can push our alma mater to divest. We can support groups like 350.org, Third Act, which is brand new, it's for people over 60. We can support Sunrise Movement for folks under 30, led by folks under 30. We can support Extinction Rebellion, all the other grassroots efforts to turn the tide. We can put our bodies on the line and risk arrest in nonviolent resistance to fossil fuels. By inspiring significant action, preachers can challenge the deathly status quo of business as usual and rouse society out of apathy and inaction. Number 8, deepen reverence for nature. Our Western society treats the natural world as an object to master, dominate, and exploit, and preachers can call us to reclaim the sacredness of earth. After all, nature is a place where humans have always encountered God. So say generations of mystics and theologians, including Moses and St. Paul. As poet Gerard Manley Hopkins puts it, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. Destroying earth is therefore a desecration, a sin against the Creator. So in addition to preaching reverence for God's creation, maybe we can plant a community garden in the vacant lot behind our church. Maybe we can support land trusts to preserve farms and woods and open space. Maybe we can partner with organizations to bring inner city children into natural settings. Maybe we can sponsor retreats and hikes and worship services that explore the wonders of creation. Step by step, we can begin to reclaim what traditional indigenous societies have never forgotten. The land itself is sacred. Discovering this for ourselves will affect our behavior. We only fight to save what we love. Which brings me to my final aim in preaching. Number 9, and it really could be number 1. Encourage love, cultivate love. Whenever I preach, I try to evoke the presence of a God who loves us beyond measure, a God who heals and redeems, who liberates and forgives. I preach about a God who honors and shares our climate grief, a God who weeps with us. I preach about a God who understands our outrage and fear and sorrow as the living world around us is destroyed. A God, in the words of Peter Sautel, who calls us to active resistance, not to quiet acceptance. I preach about a God who knows our guilt and complicity in that destruction, and who gives us power to amend our lives. I preach about a God who longs to create a beloved community that includes all beings, not just human beings. I preach about a God who sets us free from the fear of death and who gives us strength to bear witness to a love that nothing can destroy. When people are going mad with hatred and fear, only love can restore us to sanity. When we deliver a strong climate sermon and trust in the power of the Holy Spirit, we're like the boy in the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. We put our words in Jesus' hands, and through his grace and power, maybe our small offering will become a catalyst that enables a crowd to be fed. Maybe our words, like those of Ezekiel, will be infused with spirit power to enliven that valley of dead, dry bones and breathe life into a multitude. Maybe that homily, that word of encouragement or challenge or consolation, maybe that homily will contribute to a social tipping point that releases rapid societal transformation. You know, Holy Week and Easter and Earth Day are all approaching. And this year we have a special opportunity to amplify the power of our witness. We can register our climate sermons and prayer vigils with Green Faith's global initiative, Sacred Season for Climate Justice. All 5 of the world's major religions celebrate a holy day or season between now and early May. And members of faith communities around the world will hold special events and services that proclaim one urgent message: climate justice now. So when you preach a climate justice, climate resilience sermon sometime this month, as I hope you will, please be sure to register your service with Sacred Season for Climate Justice. Thank you, friends. May God be with us as we preach and pray and work together to build that beloved community, to welcome that beloved community that God so longs to make manifest on the earth. And thank you for being here, and I look forward to our conversation that follows. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much. What a wonderful, compelling, sacred presentation you've just shared. I know you can't see or hear anyone, and neither can I, but I'm going to give my own applause and encourage everyone joining in to do so as well. Just a reminder, if you have questions for Margaret, if anything has come up during her presentation, please drop those questions in the Q&A function. We will turn to our Q&A time in just a couple of minutes. Before we do so, I just wanted to share with everyone a resource that you can use for your Earth Day sermons, your Earth Day service, and even beyond that. We hope that this will launch your engagement in climate justice preaching, or continue it. I'm sure a lot of you here are already on it, not only for Earth Day Sunday this year, but beyond. So this year, Creation Justice Ministries has released an Earth Day Sunday resource called Weathering the Storm, Faithful Climate Resilience. And I just want to take a few moments to share that resource with you so you can see how to use it in your congregation. So this is the resource, and a couple points that I want to make for you all. The first is we provide stories of resilience here, which are stories of congregations who have taken steps, either physically, socially, or spiritually, to build climate resilience in their community. I think these are incredibly compelling stories that are both helpful for us to imagine, right? Just like number 3 from Margaret, imagine a positive vision of a future, see tangibly what congregations are doing to build a positive vision for a future. But I think most important for this program here today is towards the end of this resource, Weathering the Storm, which Helen has dropped into the chat, the link where you can download this, are a few Bible studies and sermon starters that you can use here. So there's 3 texts that we've identified that you could choose to chew on and think about as an Earth Day Sunday sermon, or beyond that. These are pertinent for any Sunday. They're not tied to the lectionary. And we've provided the scripture there, but also a short reflection and some questions on how you might engage these, either as a pastor in your community sharing from the pulpit, or leading a small group, or maybe the green team at your congregation. So this resource is available on the homepage of Creation Justice. It's creationjustice.org. With that, I'm going to go ahead and shift over to Q&A. So if you haven't dropped your questions in, please do so. I'll invite Margaret to come join us on the screen here. And our first question, Margaret, just to start out here, is kind of a logistical one, but we had some folks asking if you would be able to share your outline. I think there are people here who are reporting back to their committees, and I'm sure we'll want to revisit that. But is that something that you'd be able to share? I can share it in the email follow-up as well. Yeah, thank you. That's a I think so. I think so. Yeah, I think I can do that. I think maybe what I'll do is the only reason I'm hesitating is the American Psychiatric Association is putting out a book sometime later this year about about how mental health practitioners need to be paying attention to climate crisis. And I have a chapter in the book that walks through 10, I didn't have time to do all 10, but walks through 10 things that faith communities need to do. So I might need to wait until that book comes out until I can do that. But the recording is available, right? Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah. So we will make the recording available next week, and it's on Facebook right now also, but we'll send it out next week. So you can definitely share the recording with your community. Great. So the first question that came up, which I think is one that frequently comes up, which is around what text do I preach? So the question is, I'll be preaching a text at the end of April on climate change, asking for any brilliant suggestions on selecting that perfect text. Yeah, I'm in the Episcopal Church, and in the Episcopal Church, you don't get to choose your text. You receive the lectionary and you work with it. So I've actually taken, I confess, a certain amount of pride in feeling like I can take almost any text and it could connect with addressing climate change and empowering us to address climate change. I noticed in the chat that one person did pick Acts 9, the story of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. And that was the text in the first sermon I ever preached about God's love for creation was I used that text. This was back in 1989. It was after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and I didn't know a thing about preaching on eco-theology. It was not part of my seminary training, but I thought, okay, this clearly is a road to Damascus moment when we need to be changing course. So I preached my heart out, and I sat down feeling kind of proud of myself. Like, that was a pretty good sermon for someone who's never preached about climate change and creation care before, and I had never even heard a sermon about it before. But at the door to the church, a very nice woman came up to me and said, that was a good sermon, but I really don't get it. What does religion have to do with ecology? What does God have to do with the earth? And I realized that we have a lot more preaching and teaching to do.
But anyway, I love, that's a great text. Earth Sunday is April 24th, and that is the second Sunday of Easter. And that's in the lectionary I use, that's the Doubting Thomas passage. That's, the risen Christ comes and Thomas wasn't there. I have preached at least half a dozen Earth Day sermons based on that text. And so if you go to Reviving Creation and just look up Earth Day, go to the sermon page, you'll see I have almost 100 sermons in there about preaching. It almost doesn't matter what text, but that's a good one too.
Yeah, and so there was some interaction earlier in the chat with folks sharing what they're preaching and kind of their approach. If you are preaching a sermon on this coming up and you have your text and you want to share that, please share it in the chat because it's really fun to see. And I'm with you, Margaret. I love choosing, a text that is a little more challenging, that, is not Genesis 2 or the Christ hymn in Colossians, that is, kind of wrestling with a text and asking, where is creation in this? Where is hope? What can this teach us about the climate crisis? And I think that exercise in itself for me is transformative. And I think when we're able to share that from the pulpit, can be helpful for our congregants too. Yeah. So a question from Lella in the chat. What's the best way for lay people to support their clergy in engaging in climate preaching?
Oh, what a great question. I just can imagine, having a private conversation and just saying, look, I'm worried about this. It's on my mind. I need some guidance. How do I pray about this? Can help me find some meaning in it. I mean, just to let the pastor know that you might let them know you've got their back, that if there is some pushback, you're going to support them. And preaching is not necessarily, it's really about who you have to know your own congregation. Preaching may not be the place to begin the conversation. You might want to begin the conversation with an adult ed program or a forum, bring in a climate scientist or bring in, and then eventually bring it to the pulpit. But I think letting your pastor know that this matters to you, I think helps a lot.
Great. This is a question from Don. And Don is asking, they're saying that I guess they've been told that they need to preach about other things versus just climate change or creation, care, and justice. And I definitely see this, I think for those of us who are passionate about it, this is what we want to talk about. And, maybe there are pressures from congregants or from, other directions that are telling us we need to stop talking about climate change for once and talk about something else. How would you suggest that Don navigates that challenge?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to have a steady diet of having everything be about climate change every single sermon. But I think there's we have a long way to go until we get there. I think every sermon can be about encouragement, about touching into the power of God. Maybe you just mentioned climate change as one of the stressors that we're experiencing right now. Just sort of drop that in to the sermon. It's not a big sermon all dedicated to climate emergence, but you're just naming it like this is something that's part of our faith that we need to be addressing. So just help, and also introducing it into the prayers. My vision of possibility is that one day care for creation will be woven into every aspect of our life in community as Christians. So it'll just naturally be part of our adult ed and our children's ed and our prayer. So you don't need to hammer on climate change every Sunday, but as Jim Antle has been saying for a while, he said, if we don't preach about climate change every few weeks or at some relative frequency, every sermon in 10 years or 20 years is going to be about grief. It's going to be about grief. So we need to speak up.
Yeah. And, of course, one of the realities of climate change is that it touches every part of our lives. And so absolutely, I think there's such a beauty to taking Earth Day Sunday and preaching on climate change. And if that's the only time that you preach about climate change, I guess that's a shame. Not saying that that's what anyone here is doing, but I love that, Margaret, small touch points so that you're just, and this, I think this works in more conservative audiences too, who may not be as comfortable, that if you can kind of slowly introduce it, weave it in wherever you can in the prayers, just making brief light connections with whatever the text is, that gets people more comfortable with it than, coming in once a year and, hitting people over the head with it.
I also think it also can be wise to notice what the congregation already cares about. So because as you say, climate change affects everything. So if this is a congregation that cares about poverty, you can make the links to climate change, how climate change affects the poor. If it's a congregation that cares about racism and social justice, there's a natural, about immigration and migrants, natural connection. So if you can just lift up what the congregation already values as part of their history and identity, and make the link to climate change. Climate change is a so-called threat multiplier. It makes all these difficult issues more challenging. Then people will find their way into caring about it as well.
Yeah, great. So our final question here is a question from Greg, is, their fossil fuels are obviously a huge contributor to climate change, but they're not the only one. That there's other factors. How would you recommend talking about some of the other contributors to climate change, like soil degradation, industrial agriculture, et cetera?
Right, and climate change is also kind of a catch-all of, I'm thinking also of species extinction, which is somewhat distinct. I feel like in my role as preacher, my job is not to supply all the solutions or all advocate for all the public policies. It's more to frame this as a spiritual, moral, theological issue. Here's some basic facts about it, and then let's get to work and figure out how we can contribute to solutions. So you can bring in the speaker. We don't need to provide the laundry list of solutions. We can direct people to go to drawdown.org and take a look at the solutions there. Or address an issue that's, if you live in a farm country, then talk about soil right there. You don't have to do it all.
Yeah, that's so great. How is climate change affecting where you are locally, really pinpointing. Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Margaret. It's such a gift to have you here. Please, everyone share your thanks in the chat. What an amazing presentation. This has been really helpful for me thinking about, I'll be preaching for Earth Day Sunday, and as I form my sermon, and, even beyond Earth Day Sunday, whenever I'm preaching, whether it's on climate change or not, I think these 9 points are just extremely, extremely helpful. So thank you. Before we close out, I just want to share 2 upcoming events with everyone. The first one is, I guess the first one was on the right here, which is on April 22nd, Creation Justice Ministries is hosting an ecumenical virtual Earth Day service that is at noon Eastern time on Friday, April 22nd. Helen will drop the link into the chat. There's the long URL there, but you don't need to type that out. You'll get the link in the chat, and I'll also share it in the follow-up email. The second is next month's Faithful Resilience webinar is on climate disasters and faithful resilience, preparing your congregation for climate disasters. This is co-hosted with the Southeast Faith Leaders Network. And as we start to get into climate disaster season, with hurricanes accelerating and intensifying and wildfires intensifying, we want to share some steps for how you can talk about climate disasters in your congregation and prepare your congregation if you are in places that are susceptible to intensifying climate disasters. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. It was such a gift to share this evening with you. Go and be well and cultivate resilience in your communities. Thanks, everyone.